The news you're getting on this show is non-corporatized, independent activist news, and we'd like to keep it going. So to become a patron, visit patreon.com/actout. This week on Act Out, the G20. The history of this meeting of bankers and finance ministers turned vapid soiree for the figureheads of state in a global capitalist empire. Plus, the most recent G20 protests in Hamburg, where hundreds of thousands took to the streets to stand up to all that the G20 represents. And how were they met? Finally, the Mariner East 2 pipeline and the community of tree dwellers standing and sitting in its way. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. This past weekend, the G20 summit was held in Hamburg, Germany, and protesters made damn sure that this celebration of capitalist oppression did not go unattended by the people. But before we head to the front lines to see what happened in the streets, let's take a look at what the G20 really is. So the G20 is the G7. US, Britain, France, Japan, Germany, Italy, and Canada, plus another 13 industrialized or soon-to-be industrialized nations such as China, Brazil, India, Russia, and South Africa. And if those sound familiar to you, that's because they are the BRICS nations, an association of the 5 largest emerging economies and sort of a cohesive capitalist response to US-run economic hegemony globally. Now, in the past, the G7, which was formerly the G8 before that awkward Crimea incident in 2013, in the past, the G7 was able to keep this most exclusive meeting from the developing BRICS. But as the BRICS nations made their way up the capitalist ladder, G7 could no longer pretend that BRICS weren't as good at oppression and extraction as the exclusive 7 were. Indeed, capitalism is a game that any country can win, as long as they're willing to lose basic human rights, access to clean air, water, food, and bow down to the almighty dollar, or whatever other symbol the banks and shitstains of industry deem the crown jewel of their global empire. So the original G20 meetings were actually attended by finance ministers and central bankers. It wasn't until 2008 that the first summit took place in D.C., as the global financial crisis suggested strongly that heads of state should at least kind of look like they give a shit about the fate of millions of people. And yet, despite the smiles and handshakes, it is precisely this meeting of bankers paradigm that still drives the G20 meetings. How can a select few people hold on to their pieces of paper through violent extraction and oppression while making it look like they give a rat's ass about people and planet? Things like climate change and migration get thrown onto the agenda while the overarching system congratulates itself on going to Hamburg for 2 days, taking in a Beethoven concert, and ultimately changing nothing but time zones. Significant agreements are not decided or assigned at the G20, but rather worked out at separate, way more private meetings. As Canadian journalist Bill Kelly commented, "All we'll see of the politicians this weekend are the staged smiles and handshakes and a vague promise that they will work together to make the world a better place." What the G20 really is, then, is a symbol of the gross actions and insidious future intentions of the global capitalist empire, and a very real slap in the face for people around the globe, not least of all residents of the host city, that suffer from the political and economic moves that represent the G20 and all its bankers, corporations, and political accomplices. One might even think that the powers that be hold these meetings just to further antagonize people, to give the police state some live-action practice. Whatever their twisted target is, it's important that we as people take the opportunity not just to protest, but to grow and refine our resistance, and more importantly, our building of alternatives, to build real solidarity and cooperation in the face of a coordinated and vicious state. With that in mind, let's head to the front lines and see what transpired in the streets of Hamburg this past weekend. Hamburg is a city with a proudly radical past. Organizing on both sides of the G20 began months ago, with the powers that be dropping more than 50 million euros on the event, plus taking precautionary measures like setting up a makeshift prison in an old warehouse supermarket. Protesters and organizers planned their actions diligently, maneuvering through attempted sabotage and finalizing Plan Bs and Cs to most events in case of extreme changes in circumstances. Already in late June, the first wave of actions rolled out. On June 24th, refugees, migrants, and their networks launched a demonstration and G20 protest titled "We Are Here," demanding an end to colonization, exploitation, war, and deportation, as well as a united front against racism, the right to free migration, and equal rights for refugees and migrants. To see images from that event, check out this link, bit.ly/weareherefb, which will also be included in the show description. In the following days leading up to the summit, Anarchical Initiative held forums, lectures, and panels while police harassment and legal subversion attempted to crush protest camps and rights to free speech and assembly. On June 27th, the No G20 International Coordination posted a press release stating, "The right of assembly has been suspended for a huge part of the Hamburg region for the 2 days of the summit. Those hoping to camp in Hamburg have had to go to court to secure the right to do so, only to see the so-called blue zone overturn this right de facto." Despite the best efforts by the powers that be, decentralized infrastructures were built and maintained through the G20 weekend, providing housing, food, and information on transportation, info points, and social media accounts to follow for real-time, trustworthy updates. Meanwhile, more than 20,000 police were drafted into the city, coming from all over Germany and as far away as Holland and Austria. Protesters, on the other hand, were not allowed such free movement. Activists from both the north and the south were stopped and detained at the border. Chancellor Merkel had bragged about how great Germany is with free speech, stating that she supports the right to protest as long as it's peaceful. Ironic, because the day before the summit, July 6th, protesters marching with a planned anti-capitalist protest found themselves rushed by riot cops a mere 50 meters or about 160 feet from the march's starting point. The Welcome to Hell demonstration started with music and speeches before assembling about 12,000 people to march towards the red zone of the summit halls. According to press and people at the scene, cops had started bringing in water cannons and heavily armored cars already a few hours before the scheduled start of the march. They then proceeded to block the path of the march before anyone had even started marching. And once the march began, police cracked down drastically and quickly, using said water cannons, tear gas, concussion grenades, and their own riot-geared-up selves to beat protesters and disperse the crowd. A police officer who was questioned about the push said that they were moving against the crowd due to the fact that protesters were wearing masks. Interesting. Well, here's what the police push looked like from the streets. Reports after the push said that dozens, if not hundreds of people had been injured due to police violence. As the push continued, protesters set up barricades of building materials and launched spontaneous demonstrations all over the city that continued into the night and included several more violent clashes between police and protesters. Press from the streets confirmed that police acted without provocation and violently attacked protesters who were simply marching or even just standing there. On July 7th, as fires from the night before still smoldered in the streets, the first official day of the summit kicked off, with a delay thanks to a well-coordinated morning blockade that stalled the advancement of several delegations from entering the so-called red zone, where the summit was taking place. Throughout the morning and afternoon, riots continued, even as police had banned all demonstrations. Militant activists pushed towards the red zone while simultaneously across the city, events, speeches, and actions took place. Various blocks took to the streets in protest. For example, students in Hamburg had called for a walkout, and about 4,000 engaged in a Youth Against G20 demonstration. According to press and activists on the ground, pretty much all protesters were met with violence. At one demonstration, cops kettled and deployed a water cannon against about 50 peaceful protesters. Violence escalated as cops continued to deploy water cannons, tear gas, and concussion grenades against activists across the city. Press and legal personnel were not immune. The leftist German zine Junge Welt reported that at least one press photographer had been beaten by police. And Enough is Enough reported that on Sunday, 8th of July, about 1:30 a.m., one of our lawyers of the legal aid team was attacked by several policemen who grabbed him in his face, twisted his arm, and dragged him out of the pre-charged detention center. Into the night, cops brought machine guns into the streets, and while live ammunition was confirmed, there are no reports of activist casualties due to gunfire. For more on what took place in the streets, check out these images from the G20 protests. Actions then continued on Saturday, July 8th, as did police harassment, including blocking protesters' paths, stalking, kettling, and intermittent bouts of violence via water cannons, pepper spray, and beatings. Towards the end of the day, reports came in that police were spraying water cannons that contained pepper spray, and again attacking media, assaulting, and injuring those reporting on the protests. Throughout the city, as many as 200,000 protesters made up of various blocks and groups, from anti-police brutality to climate justice, staged events throughout the day. A giant Solidarity Without Borders event was reported to have amassed around 100,000 people. Activist press also reported that police were looking for and detaining foreign protesters and using social media to try and rat out people who took part in the G20 actions. As posted by Enough is Enough, and something that's just good advice for any protest, if you are arrested, don't say anything, don't sign anything. Events and actions throughout the G20 protest days included a wide array of tactics, from banner drops to clown costumes, from water to land. The Global Solidarity Summit, a G20 alternative summit, was held the 2 days before G20 and sought to discuss and plan global networks of solidarity to precisely address the things that no capitalist nation ever could: social inequality, climate devastation, war, displacement, and more. Street theater provided a powerful visual on June 5th when activists dressed up as apathetic zombies slowly meandered through the streets of Hamburg before waking up to the real world of engagement and human connection. One of the organizers of the actions told CNN, "We cannot wait until change happens from the world's most powerful. We have to show political and social responsibility. All of us. Now." And ultimately, that's what these protests were about. They weren't just about Trump or Putin or Erdogan. They were about the people and our stand against capitalism and for each other. They were about the YPJ and YPG flags that flew for the revolution in Rojava. They were about the people of Hamburg who refused to be a political piece in Merkel's attempt to showcase them as docile and obedient. They were about 2/3 of the world's population that lives on land claimed by the countries of the G20, and the other third that suffers under the weight of their obese capitalism. They were about the violence perpetuated by these states. As Croatian philosopher and co-founder of the Democracy in Europe movement, Srećko Horvat said in an interview with Democracy Now!, we should always remember what Bertolt Brecht said. What is robbing a bank in comparison to forming a bank? And the same, I would say, goes now for the G20 in Hamburg. What is the violence on the streets compared to the violence of the G20, of the governments which are part of the G20, of the violence of the Saudis making trade deals with Donald Trump and then bombing Yemen? What is the violence on the streets of Hamburg these days? A few burned cars, compared to the violence of 1 million and more people displaced from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all the wars which are taking place, still taking place, all around the world. I think we should really deconstruct the notion of violence and what is happening here in Hamburg at the moment. If a burnt car fills you with rage but a $6 billion arms deal doesn't, your rage is grossly misplaced. If being stuck in traffic because protesters have blocked the road fills you with hate, imagine how you'd feel confronted by a police state that routinely harasses and kills your friends and family. Whether I always agree with a particular brand of property destruction isn't the point. I don't agree with every letter-writing campaign or sit-in either. Black bloc is a tactic. Property destruction is a tactic. They are tactics that should be used with pointed consideration, like any tactic. So maybe burning that random parked car, maybe that wasn't great, but burning a bulldozer, or slashing tires on that cop car, or destroying Hummers, etc., etc. You don't have to personally agree with or engage in these tactics, but you do need to consider not only the perspective of the oppressed and the right of the oppressed to fight back, but also consider your own perspective. Who are you angry at, and why? And understand that the goal with these particular tactics isn't to convert people. Progress isn't a church. Some of those zombies will wake up and fight in this way or that way, and some might never wake up at all. The state is not only a system of hierarchy, it is a state of mind, and only by shifting our paradigms, by toppling the state that exists in our minds, can we truly engage in powerful solidarity and effectively combat the state of capitalism in all of its forms. For a recap on a longer conversation on violence versus property destruction, take a look at our post-J20, not G20, segment Ask an Anarchist at the link below or in the video description. Now moving on, but still very much on the front lines, Camp White Pine is a forest defense camp currently engaging in a large-scale tree sit in central Pennsylvania in order to combat the Mariner East 2 pipeline. This 350-plus-mile-long proposed pipeline would carry natural gas liquids through Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania to an export facility on the East Coast. The project isn't only important because natural gas currently gets most bang for its buck in foreign markets, but it's also wildly dangerous for both people and planet. Indeed, just last week, around a dozen Chester County households experienced cloudy water or loss of supply from their private wells, forcing some families from their homes near a location where Sunoco Pipeline is conducting horizontal directional drilling about 150 feet below ground for the construction of its Mariner East 2 pipeline. And as Camp White Pine founder Elise Gerhardt posted on Facebook early Saturday morning, "You're really going to tell me that I'm going to go to jail if I try to prevent the same kind of drilling activity that just ruined people's drinking water from happening on my mom's private property against her will?" It seems that that is in fact exactly what Sunoco is trying to tell Elise and her fellow pipeline resistors. It also seems, however, that they are not willing to listen to that shit. For more on this story, we sat down with Elise and Dan from Camp White Pine last week. Take a look. So I understand this started directly because your land, the land that you and your mother live on, I believe, has been directly affected. How did that first start? What was your first interaction with the company?
Right. My parents were approached in March of 2015 by a landman for Sunoco, who came to the house, made an easement offer, and in the same breath said, if you don't take this offer, we're going to take the land anyway through eminent domain. And so we spent some of 2015 being sued for the land, taken through Court of Common Pleas at the county level. And we're in South Central Pennsylvania, by the way. And so we went through court, and the judge ruled against us in early 2016. In March of 2016, Sunoco came in to do clear cutting for the project, even though it would be another 11 months before they ever got permits for the project. And that was the first time where we started to use direct action against the project. We had been doing other things in the meantime, like trying to fight permitting, for instance. And we had delayed the project for about a year doing that. But in March of 2016, they were coming in with the chainsaws. So we staged a series of tree sits here on my family's land. There were 5 people that wound up being criminally prosecuted after that, and had the charges dropped after 8 months of going back and forth through court. And so November of last year, those charges were dropped. From the tree sits, we were able to prevent about a dozen trees from being cut, and the trees in the path of the pipeline that are left have been fortified into a more elaborate tree sit. And we also have a 24/7 on the ground encampment going to support that tree sit, which is called Camp White Pine.
So what are you looking at right now in terms of, I saw on the page there was an injunction that you guys are dealing with at the moment. What are you expecting to deal with in the coming days or weeks?
That injunction is coming from the same county court judge who ruled against us in the eminent domain case. He's kind of been against us and for the company this entire time, almost a year and a half now. So basically, the injunction authorizes the sheriffs to come in and remove people. Last year, they were also accompanied by the state police. There were almost 20 cops here probably last year, and maybe 20 protesters. We're basically expecting the same, but maybe a little bit worse. I mean, we know that Energy Transfer Partners works with Tiger Swan, these private security companies. We saw what happened with that at protests in North Dakota. And so we're not really sure, basically, is the short of it. We know that they are desperate. They're way behind schedule. The fight against DAPL set that company back so much, cost them so many millions of dollars. We're costing them millions of dollars already, delaying this project, not just us, but other people too. And so they're desperate and they're dangerous. And they have the local law enforcement, apparently the state law enforcement, and their own private security.
Run me through like a basic day. I'm assuming that, the cops never tell you when they're going to show up, and so what does a typical day look like? How are you guys prepared, not just physically, of course, but also mentally and emotionally, because this is such an intense fight that you're waging here?
Yeah, I mean, for me and my family, this has been going on for over 2 years. And for the folks who've come down here to camp, we've been at this since the first week of February. So basically every day we've been ready for workers to be coming in, for the police to be coming in. I mean, in the meantime, they have been doing lots of surveillance, lots of harassment. We've had helicopter flyovers almost every single day, drone flyovers, private security following people, watching us from the easement across the road from this property. And so I mean, basically at this point, we have nothing to hide, and we haven't been hiding what we're doing. We're saying we're here, we're going to stand here, and we're going to get in your way. And you can make that decision to, come down here and make a show of force, or you can respect our rights and leave us be and leave the land be.
And I think it's important, and I'll also point this out, but, as far as one believes in private property or not, this is a matter of the police and possibly federal cops coming onto private property trying to remove people for the sake of a dirty energy project.
Yeah, and definitely, realizing that that is a really important legal leverage point. It's really important. It is about this pipeline, it's about this property, but it's also about, fighting the system that has been doing this for 500 years, and recognizing that there have been the people whose land this is have been fighting this stuff for over 500 years, and being really inspired by the resistance at Standing Rock. That was a continuation of over 500 years of indigenous resistance, on this continent, and really realizing that that's the context that we're in, and that's the context that these ecocidal and genocidal pipeline projects and extraction projects are in, is vital to why people are here and why people are fighting this.
Yeah, it's like Casey Camp Hornick put it. First they came with smallpox blankets, and then they came with bulldozers. It's a continuation of colonization and imperialism. It's just that now a lot of white people find themselves in the crosshairs of capitalism and decline. So final question. I noticed that you had also posted, interestingly enough, about Rojava, and we just had Dilar Dirick on the show last week. So it's sort of an interesting closing question. This idea of solidarity and the question of actual, like, real solidarity as opposed to, posting a pride flag on Facebook or something. Talk about this issue of real solidarity and what you've been able to create and also enter into by having this camp at White Pine.
We're just trying to use this position, just like, Dan was explaining, like using the privilege of being on this private property and trying to stop this pipeline project. We're using that spot now that has been created by having Camp White Pine to try to bring attention to other struggles and let people know that, like, this thing is multifaceted. It's not just about private property in the path of a pipeline. It's about so much more than that.
Yeah, and it's like, obviously, these fighting in these local camps right here, fighting in Huntington County and fighting against this pipeline, but all of these struggles around the world are interconnected. And, it's about global capitalism and imperialism. And when we can live in this weird internet age where we can, share photos and make connections with people fighting ISIS and Turkey and Assad, halfway around the world, really creating something really incredible, we can look to them for inspiration.
To support Camp White Pine, visit them on Facebook at Facebook.com/Camp White Pine PA, where you can find links to support their legal fund and also assist with buying them camp gear via their Amazon wishlist. And that will do it for this week's heavy dose of dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. Check out the last slide and the YouTube description to see the sites mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and subscribe on YouTube. Until next time, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/ActOut.